Good morning, or so good afternoon. I'm Takushi Nohara from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. Sincerely welcome to the lecture uh, named Representation of History in Urban Landscape in Lisbon and Florence. And this lecture are very much kindly offered by Professor Pedro Oliveira, Professor Pedro Cardim, and Dr. Chiara Renzo from Florence. And it's organized or it's offered by the master degree program, History in Public Sphere. So I don't have enough time to explain about the program, but please visit this website. It's offered by the Central European University, and the students of the program. Now we have the first year. So the first students of this program began to study in the last year from October, and the students the first year, so they stay in Vienna or in Budapest at Central European University, and then so they move to the Tokyo, to Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, and then so they can choose either Nova, the New Lisbon University, or University of Florence. And then in the fourth semester, they can choose one of the four university for their study. So the Nova, or the Lisbon, or so University of Florence, or Central European University in Budapest and in Vienna, or in Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. And then now the first cohort of the HIPS, the program students are now to moving to Florence and to Lisbon, and that is one reason to organize this special lecture, but also this this lecture is open to all who are interested in the history, or in the public history, or history in public sphere. So let me introduce the professors who give today the lectures. The first will be the Professor Pedro Oliveira from Lisbon, about the public also representation of history in Lisbon. So please, thank you very much, Pedro.
Thank you very much, Taku. I say hello to all the colleagues and to all the students who are here present. I'm grateful for this invitation. This is really a very sort of unpretentious presentation that I will undertake here. Let me just ask you, before I explain the approach that I'm going to take, let me just ask you if I can share the screen to use some PowerPoint and eventually the Google Maps application, because what I'm trying to do here is a sort of imaginary walk, a sort of virtual walk in some parts of Lisbon, so that you can get this notion of how the 20th century history is very much present in the urban landscape. That's at least what I thought that you wanted me to speak about. So what I'll do here is to highlight some traces of revolutions and political change in Lisbon throughout the 20th century, taking you into this kind of imaginary walk that I sincerely hope we can replicate in person when you are all able to travel to Lisbon in future occasions, and hopefully for some of the students in September. So let me start. So my idea would be to take you for this sort of, are you able to visualize the map?
Okay. Yes. Yes.
So take you through this imaginary walk that would start, let's say, here in the Marquis of Pombal Square, which is really one of the symbolic centers of Lisbon. We would go down this Avenue of Liberdade, the Boulevard of Liberty, as it was named in the 19th century. Then we would go to this elevator, the Santa Justa elevator, a very exquisite 19th century iron wrought elevator. And we would then move to this part, which is, let me see, Largo Square here, which was the place where it's a restaurant, which was the place, I'll show you an image later, which was the place where some of the most dramatic theatrical scenes of the 1974 revolution took place. So this is where some of the most decisive moments of the downfall of the dictatorship took place in the 25th of April 1974, and then we would sort of end this walk in a sort of, well, sort of sinister place, but the memories of which have been pretty much erased, and this is something that can be discussed in the ambit of this program, the sort of civic protests that sometimes erupt when gentrification processes take place in some cities. So we would end this walk in the former headquarters of the political police that were turned 20 years ago into a sort of luxury condominium. And this led to some protests by people with some sort of civic and historical conscience that were pretty outraged by the fact that this was taking place. And one of the outcomes of this social or civic upheaval was the erection of a new museum dedicated to the memory of the dictatorship. So I'm sorry for being rather clumsy in manipulating Google Maps, but I just wanted you to get this notion of the sort of walk. It would be a sort of 2-3 hour walk in Lisbon, that would start right here, right in the Marquis of Pombal. I will return to this figure of Marquis of Pombal later on. This would be my first image, the Avenue of Liberdade. I will get to it in a moment. So the late 19th century, early 20th century was indeed an epoch of great transformations in the history of the city, both in its urban configuration and architectural outlook, but also in terms of its population size, which jumped from a total number of around 300,000 inhabitants in the beginning of the 20th century to something like 800,000 inhabitants in the early 1960s. So in the period that we are going to talk about, Lisbon experienced a very dramatic growth. This may look rather modest when compared with let's say, a metropolis like Tokyo. But for a country whose total population varied between 5.5 and 9 million throughout this period, this testified a certain macrocephaly of Lisbon with regard to the rest of the country. One can say that the modern expansion of Lisbon began to take shape in the last decades of the 19th century, still under the liberal monarchy, when the country experienced modest but sustained economic growth. The urban planners of the time looked to Paris and other big European cities for inspiration when they came up with a blueprint for extending the city beyond the confines of the old medieval nucleus and the downtown area that was built after the 1755 earthquake. In 1879, the construction of the Avenue of Liberty was initiated, and a decade later, the plans for the erection of new middle-class neighborhoods in places like Campo do Rico, Stefania, or the Avenidas Novas were approved. Until the 1960s, these would be the three main areas from which urban expansion irradiated. This avenue, Avenida da Liberdade, soon became one of the most elitist and sophisticated arteries of Lisbon, the sort of place where lawyers and prestigious doctors would open their offices next to fancy restaurants and expensive shops. Later, it would also be the preferred area for the construction of huge cinema theaters that were so typical of mid-20th century cities. A small number of them still have their doors open, but nowadays they are mostly venues run by the municipality for various cultural ends or commercial spaces explored by franchises like Hard Rock Cafe in Lisbon. Ironically, just as Baron Haussmann's boulevards in Paris could not contain the riots that erupted in 1871 with the Paris Commune, in the same way, the new wide and geometrically shaped avenues of bourgeois and aristocratic Lisbon were also unable to contain revolutionary crowds in 1910, when the Democratic Republic was finally established. So, as I was telling you, a rather obvious approach to modern Lisbon, and particularly to Republican Lisbon, would be in the Marquis of Pombal Square, that was inaugurated in 1934, but actually was planned in 1915 by the regime, which had literally been born out of the barricades set up in this large field that is now the symbolic center of the capital. Fierce combats took place in October 1910, when a motley band of low-ranking officers, sailors, members of secret societies, and armed civilians were able to prevail over demoralized and poorly led loyalist troops. Now, I'm not 100% sure about the reasons that motivated the Republican authorities to erect the huge statue dedicated to the Marquis of Pombal, this despotic but enlightened prime minister of the late 18th century. But I would risk to say that most of these reasons were related to two factors. Let me just recover here the statue of the Marquis of Pombal. Let's see if I can do this. Okay. Okay. You can see it's really a huge statue. Okay. Well, I think you can get a look here. So I can offer a sort of informed speculation, informed conjecture about the reasons that led the Republicans to choose the Marquis of Pombal as one of the sponsors of their modernizing plans to Lisbon. One was the modernizing reputation of Pombal himself, the man who supervised the reconstruction of Lisbon after the huge earthquake of 1755. So he undertook this project with a remarkable zeal, but also with an iron fist. And these were features that were not unpalatable to many Republican reformers who believed that in order to bring about enlightened transformations in the country, one might have to employ some pretty drastic means. And let me just show you here an image that somehow strengthens this notion. Wait, sorry. Sorry. Okay. Why am I not? Okay. So this is the image of the most charismatic prime minister of the Republic, a man named Afonso Costa, and here you have the image of Marquis Pombal, sort of blessing his some of his reforms, and here you can see the Jesuit priests departing from Lisbon. So Pombal in the late 19th century, one of his most emblematic measures was to expel the Jesuit order from Lisbon, from Portugal, I would say, and Afonso Costa, the Republican prime minister, did exactly the same, since the Republicans feared that the influence that the Jesuit order was having in the secondary education in the country was a very nefarious aspect, and they wanted to get rid of this influence and replace it by a very secular orientated education. Curiously, one of the most important Jesuit colleges in the country is now home to one of the faculties of Nova University. So when coming to Lisbon, you are able to visit this pretty historic building that was later turned into a military barracks, also with its very peculiar history, and is now home to our university. If we go down Avenida da Liberdade Boulevard, we will have the opportunity also to see a couple of landmark monuments and lieux de mémoire that are closely related to this Republican period, this very tumultuous period. And I say tumultuous because this period coincided with an escalation of social strife. There was a very tense relationship between the Republic and the working class movement, and also between the military and the regime, mostly because of Portugal's participation in World War I. In 1916, the government pretty much took the country to the war, and the military thought that the nation was mostly unprepared to meet this challenge, and this brought about a significant number of military conspiracies and interventions in the public life. So the Republican regime had a very short span of life. It ended in 1926, and one of the reasons was the big discontent that came about after Portugal's intervention in the war. Let me just show you two images that somehow highlight this in this walk that we are taking. So here we have a very exquisite building in the end of Avenida da Liberdade, the Rossio train station, a very exquisite late 19th century building that was the stage for one of the most dramatic political assassinations in 20th century Portugal. The charismatic dictator Sidónio Pais, a man that came to power in 1917 in reaction against this decision to take Portugal to the war. So he ended up being assassinated by a sort of very fierce democratic Jacobin Republican militant, and this brought to an end this brief period of military dictatorship that somehow presaged the advent of authoritarian solutions in the 1920s. Before reaching the station, one can also appreciate the rather impressive national monument to the death of the Great War that was inaugurated in 1931. This was part of an ambitious national program of erecting similar monuments so that the Republic could somehow close the wounds opened by Portugal's belligerency. But at the end of the day, this did not prevent the dissatisfaction with the effects of the war to translate into further military conspiracies. And one of these conspiracies was successful in 1926. So Portugal became a military dictatorship in that year, in 1926, that at times closely resembled some of the fascist regimes of other European countries. And democracy would only be restored in 1974. Now, for the sake of timekeeping, I'm probably moving ahead. If we go down this avenue, we could have a stop in a place called Palacio Almada. I'm not showing it here. I would have the opportunity in this real visit to make some remarks about it. But this was the place where the Portuguese youth movement had its headquarters. So in this walk, we can also have a glimpse of Portugal's fascist authoritarian past by looking at the headquarters of this organization that is now basically the home of a very conservative historical society. So if we take that very sort of exquisite elevator, iron elevator that I mentioned to you, we would go directly to the Largo do Carmo, the small square that was indeed the stage of this some of these dramatic scenes of the 1974 revolution. Actually, the square in itself is a point of great interest. You can have a superb look over the old rebuilt medieval castle. You can have a very nice glimpse over the Avenue of Liberty and the river. And you can also visit the lovely ruins of an old convent that partially survived the 1755 earthquake and is now the home of a small but very interesting private archaeological museum. Right next to this museum, you find the old barracks of the Gendarmerie, the National Republican Guard, that is now converted into a museum. And I will return to this barracks in a very short moment. Now, the dictatorship downfall was, as you may know, orchestrated by disgruntled military officers that were tired of a strategic stalemate in Africa, where Portugal had been engaged in a protracted colonial war since 1961. These military officers were mostly of the rank of captains. There were some lieutenants as well, some majors. They managed to successfully deploy a number of military units in Lisbon in the night of the 24th of April, 1974, and soon neutralized the forces that remained loyal to the dictator Marcelo Caetano. The population ignored the warnings that were emitted through the radio in order that asked them to stay in their homes, not to take part in the events that were occurring in the streets of Lisbon for fear of confrontations between armed men and civilians. But the population mostly ignored these warnings, and they approached the Largo Square, the Largo do Carmo. Let me just go back to my presentation and see a very... Okay, this is one of the most iconic images of these events. This is the Largo Square. Here you see the civilian population, the military, and this is one of the military leaders of the movement addressing the population and urging them to stay calm and obey the instructions of the rebellious troops. The dictator Marcelo Caetano had taken refuge in the military barracks that are situated in this square, in this small square. The gendarmerie was supposed to be a very loyal unit to the regime, and he hoped that some of his generals might regain control of the situation. How is this did not happen? The barracks, as you can see, were soon surrounded by an excited crowd that expressed its solidarity with the troops. Some of these protesters were most likely eager to take justice in their own hands. Caetano's extraction from the headquarters had to be negotiated by high-ranking officers that joined the captains. One of them was soon to become the new head of state, General António de Spínola. He became the president of the National Salvation Junta. This general, Spínola, who had been a military commander in Africa, was a very conservative officer who would have preferred to oversee a more cautious and gradual political transition, eventually retaining some of the policies and personnel of the old regime. But what started as a coup d'etat soon evolved to a social revolution. The population was eager for vast social changes and also keen to settle scores with some of the most repressive agents and institutions of the dictatorship, including the much feared political police named PID, Polícia Internacional de Defesa do Estado, PID, it's its acronym. PID's headquarters were actually quite close to the Largo Square, just a few meters, right in the heart of commercial and the bohemian center of Lisbon. Passers-by and neighbors could sometimes listen to the screams of people being tortured in PID's premises. The crowd surrounded the building, and some of the most violent and fortunately rare bloody events of the revolution took place there between the 25th and the 26th of April. Unfortunately, 4 people who took part in the siege of the building were killed by shots from agents that were barricaded inside the premises. Afterwards, the military were able to take fully control of the building, and the policemen were extracted from the PID headquarters that were later vandalized by the population. For years, the former PID headquarters remained emptied and sealed. And as I told you in the beginning of the talk, some 20 years ago, the building was acquired by a property developer who decided to turn it into a luxury condominium. There was a public outcry when it became known that the promoter wanted to erase all traces of the building's infamous past. He didn't even wanted an informative plate to be placed in the building's facade, because in his opinion, this would not be a very attractive element for future buyers of apartments in this condominium. But the Lisbon municipality faced significant pressure from various citizens, and in 2014, the then president of the municipality, Afonso Costa, who is now Portugal's prime minister, and coincidentally, whose father was a member of the Communist Party and also a militant against the dictatorship, he showed some comprehension towards this public outcry, and he was adamant to have this informative plate placed in the facade of this infamous building. Another positive answer to some of these concerns was provided also by the municipality, who, after much civic pressure, decided to erect a new museum dedicated to the memory of the resistance to the dictatorship. The Aljube Museum, inaugurated in 2014, that we hope to visit with you, and also where some of you will be hopefully able to take in an internship. Let me just go back to this map of Lisbon again, just to see if I can show you the Aljube Museum. Sorry. Okay. The Aljube Museum is right next to the old Cathedral of Lisbon. Let me see if I can show you the facade of this Aljube Museum, which is a really very interesting museum as well, because it was an old bishop's prison. It's where the bishops of Lisbon arrested and maintained in Gaul the priests, the clerics who prevaricated and were punished. And you can see some of the inside of the museum. It's now a very informative place where you can acquire interesting information about the history of the resistance to the dictatorship and the repressive dimension of the Estado Novo dictatorship. But we can of course, before going to the Aljube and after seeing that prison, I'm just making this last suggestion. We can all eventually have a coffee in this sort of vintage place, this very iconic early 20th century cafe, where that was attended by one of the giants of Portuguese literature of the 20th century, the modernist poet Fernando Pessoa. If you don't know Fernando Pessoa, I strongly suggest that you make yourselves acquainted with his poetry, which is really very exquisite, very interesting. And curiously, he also has a small tourist book dedicated to Lisbon, called Lisbon, What the Tourist Should See. It was published in the 1920s, and it's now a curious piece of historical tourist travel writing. So I've finished with my talk. Sorry if I exceeded some minutes the slot. I now give the word back to Taco. Thank you very much for your comprehension.
I feel like as if I was walking, would be around Lisbon. So please let me ask Pedro, please, your lecture now, and then if you have any questions, comments, and you can write the questions in chat, and also if you like to ask question personally, then so also you can. So Pedro, please, the second lecture.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes,
Is it clear?
thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Taku, for organizing this session. It's an excellent opportunity for introducing all of our colleagues and students to the kind of work we are conducting in Lisbon, and also in what way the city relates to some of the major topics of this MA program. And as a matter of fact, many of the places and buildings that was shown by Pedro a while ago will be very much central for the students who will stay in Lisbon, and the museum itself is one of the locations where our students will be able to take these internships. So we have all prepared to do that, and we are in contact with the people responsible for these institutions. My presentation will concentrate more on the colonial dimension of the history of Portugal and the way it is present in the urban landscape of the capital city of Lisbon. I will begin by presenting.
Sorry.
Yeah, disconnected. Yeah, it's okay now?
Yes.
Yeah, I will begin by presenting the major scholarly developments of the two last decades regarding the history of the Portuguese colonial past. And the second part of my presentation will be devoted to initiatives carried out by activists, so in particular African Portuguese groups, against current forms of celebration, the Portuguese colonial past. My expertise, contrary to my colleague Pedro, my expertise is in early modern history, and I devote part of my research to Portugal's colonial rule in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. So this explains why the majority of the examples I'm going to present concern this chronological period and not 19th or 20th century colonialism. As you surely know, Portugal was the head of a long-lasting colonial empire, an empire that was built in the early 16th century and lasted until 1975. And during this extremely long period, the Portuguese managed to rule over a large ensemble of territories and peoples across Asia, Africa, and America. Beginning in the early 16th century, the colonial enterprise had a strong galvanizing impact for many Portuguese, in particular members of the political elite. And it eventually became an important component of the discourse of Portuguese, so to say, national identity. From the early 19th century onwards, a series of political regimes, so the liberal constitutional regime, the republicans, and later on, the already mentioned 20th century dictatorship, used the colonial past as a legitimizing tool for their regimes. And regarding the role played by historians during the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century until the end of the dictatorship, most of the historians ended up strengthening this way of understanding the colonial past and portrayed the Portuguese overseas experience as a fundamental part of the Portuguese identity, of the Portuguese historical trajectory. The research agenda of most historians, with some exceptions, of course, and we can talk about it later on, but the research agenda of most historians was mostly oriented to underscoring the positive aspects of the Portuguese colonial rule. So colonialism and colonial past was, there is a very long tradition of understanding this experience in positive terms in Portugal. And as I said, with very few exceptions, the bulk of the historical research conducted in Portugal during the 20th century until the end of Salazar's dictatorship The dictatorship regime that was mentioned by Pedro, which lasted from the late 1920s until the mid 1970s, a very long dictatorship. Most of the historical research produced during this period was at the service of the regime's propaganda, and most historians convey the nationalist and benign image of the Portuguese colonial past. And not surprisingly, the scholarship that was produced during this period of dictatorship was almost all of it completely disconnected with the debates taking place internationally about the history of Western European empires. And the expression Portuguese discoveries, the students who are about to come to Lisbon will soon get familiar with this expression because it's very frequently mentioned by a lot of Portuguese. The Portuguese discoveries was an expression that, and still is an expression that embodies this way of viewing the Portuguese imperial past. As for the term colonial, during the dictatorship, in particular after the Second World War, it was gradually banned from the vocabulary of the historians. In particular, those historians were more at the service of the dictatorship, and in their service, these more engaged, politically engaged historians deliberately omitted the violent and exploitative character of the Portuguese overseas conquests, and the same could be said of vexed topics such as racial discrimination, slavery, transatlantic slave trade as fundamental components of the Portuguese colonial empire. Instead, they stressed the alleged Portuguese exceptional ability to deal with the peoples of different cultures and ethnicities. And the important thing to stress here is that, contrary to what would be expected, Portugal's transition to democracy in 1974 did not produce an immediate change in the picture that I've just described. First, because in the years that followed the end of the dictatorship, very few historians studied the Portuguese colonial empire in an in-depth way. In particular, the period I work on, the early stages of the empire, was barely studied right after the end of the dictatorship. The history of the colonial past had been so systematically manipulated by the dictatorship that many post-Salazar's historians avoided studying it or did not put the empire at the center of their research agendas. It was only in the 1980s, late 1980s, that Portuguese universities started to produce an increasing number of PhD dissertations on the colonial past, in particular the early modern period, so 16th, 17th, and early 18th century. One of the striking features of this new wave of studies about the colonial past was, again, the persistent lack of interest in studying 20th century colonialism, and also, again, avoiding vexed topics such as slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, and the bulk of such works was actually devoted to the 15th and 16th centuries, and the approaches were almost always centered on the Portuguese perspective, very Eurocentric, and dealt with colonial conquest as a minor aspect of the whole process. Instead, these historians concentrating on the 15th and 16th century, they underscore the maritime voyages and the early stages of the Portuguese overseas expansion in Asia. Significantly, Brazil and Sub-Saharan Africa were largely neglected as topics of research, and the same could be said of later periods of Portugal's colonial past. In fact, this first generation of studies of post-dictatorship Salazar's, they produced almost no research on the colonial rule during the period between the 17th and the 20th centuries. And as I said, topics such as slavery, transatlantic slave trade, and the enslavement of Amerindians continue to be almost completely disregarded. Overall, it can be said that this set of studies never significantly question the traditional image of the Portuguese as benign colonialists. The same could be said about the myth of the Portuguese adaptability to different ethnicities and their alleged lack of racial prejudice. These were topics very much central to the dictatorship discourse about the Portuguese colonial rule. And interestingly, after the dictatorship, they continue to be very much present, not just in the public discourse about this period of the Portuguese past, but also in the research agenda of most historians. With very few exceptions, the scholarship on Portugal's empire continued to be predominantly Eurocentric, Portuguese-centric, focusing above all on the 15th and early 16th century, and underscored the role played by the Portuguese elites and paid almost no attention to the agency of local Asian, African, or Amerindian populations. In addition to that, knowledge production in the context of maritime voyages, cartography in particular, was also a topic that attracted several scholars of this post-Salazar, post-dictatorship generation. As for engaging with international debates about European colonial past, the contribution of this first wave of studies in democratic Portugal was far from impressive. The same could be said about comparing the Portuguese case with other Western European empires. The Portuguese Empire continued to be considered somewhat exceptional. So I'm talking about a kind of an exceptionalist narrative about the Portuguese past, about the Portuguese identity. And as such, not many historians studied it comparatively, because comparing, of course, as we all know, involves to a certain extent deconstruct and put into question these exceptionalist narratives about the Portuguese colonial past. Democratic Portugal also took advantage of the colonial past, not just the research agenda, the way I've just mentioned it, but also using the colonial past for celebratory purposes. In fact, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Portuguese state authorities converted the discoveries, the so-called Portuguese discoveries, into a major topic of celebration. Following its Spanish counterpart in 1986, the Portuguese government established a commission for the commemoration of the Portuguese discoveries. Additionally, in the years that followed, Portuguese authorities sponsored a huge universal exhibit devoted to Portugal's maritime expansion, due to take place in 1998, celebrating the 500th year of Vasco da Gama's first voyage to India, so the first direct maritime voyage from Western Europe to Asia. Let me show you some images of what I'm talking about. So this is downtown, well, not exactly downtown. This is the west part of Lisbon, not, well, relatively far from the locations Pedro has just mentioned. And this is an iconic building of the Portuguese colonial past, 16th century monastery of the Hieronymites. And all this area was refurbished by the dictatorship in order to convert this neighborhood in a kind of a colonial, a celebration of the Portuguese imperial past. And so this is a square named during the dictatorship, Square of the Empire. This square is still there, so democratic Portugal did not change significantly a lot of the names that were given to different locations of the city, evoking the Portuguese colonial past, and the whole setting that was designed under the dictatorship aiming at celebrating the colonial past. And this building is significant because it is very much related to the Portuguese overseas voyages. This religious order was sponsoring a lot of initiatives of the King of Portugal, and it is said that several expeditions departed from this area. This is located near the river, and this is how it looked during the 1940s, when a major exhibit was organized by the Portuguese dictatorship celebrating the Portuguese Empire. It took place in 1940, precisely at the time Second World War was raging across Europe. So Portugal was not part of the war, and the regime celebrated that and took advantage of that situation to build a huge showcase of the so-called Portuguese world, including, of course, a lot of pavilions dedicated to the colonial territories under the rule of Portugal. And this is how it looks nowadays. As you can see, the changes are not at all significant. So this is still the so-called square of the empire. So until recently, a lot of the decoration of the garden was still evoking different colonial territories. It was only after some public movements against it that the town council of Lisbon decided to suppress, to destroy these bushes and other decoration evoking the colonial past and replaced it. So my point here is that the end of the dictatorship did not mean a dramatic change in the way Lisbon evoked the colonial past. There weren't many changes, and this relates, of course, also with the fact that within the academic milieu, in the decades immediately after the end of the dictatorship, the changes were not very significant. Another interesting and significant example of what I'm talking about is this monument here, which is located facing this square. So you cannot see it from here, but so you have this square, and so this monument here is facing the river, and this was also built in 1940 and then rebuilt in 1960, and it's still there. As you can see, this is a monument celebrating the so-called Portuguese discoveries. You have a sword here and a cross, so evoking the military spirit of the Portuguese overseas conquest, but also celebrating the role played by Catholic religion in galvanizing and legitimizing the overseas conquests. And all this is part, as I said, of this setting, this area of Lisbon facing the river. So in symbolic terms, it's also very strong because it evokes the overseas expeditions, the Portuguese seafarers. So there is a whole a very powerful and deeply rooted narrative about Portuguese heroism and the role played by Portugal in the discovery of the world. So this is, as I said, a very old narrative about the Portuguese past, about the Portuguese narrative, which was resignified in successive periods of Portuguese history. But in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, it was very much strengthened by the dictatorship. It took advantage of all this narrative and ended up rooting all these ideas in Portuguese population. And the end result of this is the fact that in present-day Portugal, there are still a lot of people that feel that these monuments are okay, that there's no need to do anything about them. In some cases, these monuments have a clear fascist aesthetic. So a lot of, well, some people now complain about them, but as you can see, this is a powerful landmark in the urban landscape of Lisbon. These are figures that evoke the main leaders of the maritime expeditions, and on top of that, you have Prince Henry, the navigator, traditionally presented as the mentor and the person, the strategist of all these voyages. So as you can see, changes were not significant. This is still there. There were some attempts to discuss and rethink this monument. I will talk about it later on in my talk. But again, my point is that Lisbon, in a way, is still awaiting a true discussion, an in-depth discussion, and a plural and just discussion about these buildings, about these monuments, about this urban landscape. One final example here is very close from here. So it's you see this monument here. So this green area, it's precisely this square. So next to the Empire Square, there is this other square, and this is a monument to one of the first governors of India. So is considered and still nowadays a hero for many Portuguese. I don't have the time to describe the kind of atrocities this man committed while in India, and some of the cruel things he carried out against Indian and Arabic populations in the west coast of India and also in the Persian Gulf. But I mean, the fact is that this monument is there in the middle of a square facing the presidential palace of Portugal. So this entanglement between democratic Portugal and symbols of the Portuguese imperial past, it's very visible, it's very present, it's very strong in Lisbon, urban and landscape. As I said, if you take all that I mentioned into account, it comes as no surprise what I've just mentioned a while ago. The imperial past was used by democratic Portugal for celebration purposes. In 1998, there was this huge world exhibit in Lisbon celebrating the voyage, the first maritime voyage from Western Europe to Asia in 1498, Vasco da Gama's voyage. This was a massive venue, and it's still there. Also, it was built it's a whole huge neighborhood in the eastern part of the city. So the opposite side of this area I've shown here. So it's totally different areas. So this means that if you move westwards, you get this area, which was refurbished under the dictatorship. If you move eastwards, in the eastern part of the city, you have all this area built in 1997-98 to celebrate the beginning of the Portuguese Empire in Asia, and this took place under the Portuguese democratic regime. So the dictatorship was over long ago, and this means that democratic politicians in Portugal, a great deal of them, still think of the Portuguese colonial past as a positive thing, and they still think that it makes sense to use the Portuguese colonial and imperial past to galvanize the Portuguese population. For instance, in 1986, when Portugal joined the European Economic Community, where was the treaty officially signed and the official celebration? Here, this building, which is not a coincidence. So the joining of Portugal to the European Economic Community in 1986 was a major celebration that took place here. More recently, as I said, this world exhibit in 1998, world exhibit devoted to Vasco da Gama, and even more recently, during the financial crisis of 2008-2012, a right-wing Portuguese government thought of using the imperial past to motivate the Portuguese in their struggle with economic and financial hardships. And so this persistent use of imperial history for political purposes, both under the dictatorship and in democratic Portugal, partly explains why so many present-day Portuguese continue to feel pride about the country's colonial past. The Catholic Church also played a part in this process. In fact, beginning in the 1990s, the Church sponsored various initiatives, international conferences, and major exhibits aimed at celebrating this Christianization of Asia, America, and to a lesser extent, Africa. The spread of Christianity by Catholic missionaries, in particular the Jesuits, was portrayed not as a clash of peoples, and cultures, but instead as a harmonious encounter of cultures. This was, together with the Portuguese discoveries, encounter of cultures is also a very frequently voiced expression to talk about what happened in the Portuguese colonial experience. Again, this very benign image of the Portuguese colonial past. Encounter of cultures, meaning that this was an event in which all parties involved dealt respectfully with religious plurality and cultural difference. And again, violence, exploitation, and discrimination were largely overlooked by these Catholic Church initiatives. I'm not going to get into much detail about scholarly developments taking place outside Portugal, which of course presented a completely different picture of the processes I'm talking about here. North America, Anglophone historians, and also in Brazil, the developments, scholarly developments taking place outside Portugal contributed to a very important and significant renovation of this field of studies, and ended up having an impact in the Portuguese scholarly milieu, and beginning in the late 1990s, at last, new research work was produced questioning this benign image of the Portuguese colonial past. But I think compared to the work that was conducted on the 19th and 20th century Portuguese colonialism, when it comes to assess the Portuguese colonial rule during the 16th and 17th centuries, things are still very much in the need for a deeper and more open and wider discussion. As I said, topics such as slave trades, transatlantic slave trades, slavery of Amerindians, or violence, exploitation, racial discrimination, all these topics are current currency for many historians working on the Portuguese colonial rule in the 19th and 20th century, but that is definitely not the case for historians working on the early modern period. We can talk about it also later on. I'd like now to use the final part of my slot and focus on developments outside the scholarly milieu. Until now, I've mentioned mostly what was going on in the academic milieu, but of course, some of the changes that I evoked, in particular, since the late 1990s, the changes towards a more open and critical discussion about the Portuguese colonial past were also the result of societal changes and the role played by activists. There is no doubt that the emergence of new perspectives about the Portuguese Empire since the late 1990s was also the result of a kind of a social demand. In the 1990s, more and more people started to contest the traditional views of Portuguese colonialism. And I remember watching debates about the colonial past in middle schools and high schools located in the suburbs of Lisbon, and watching a significant number of students of African descent, and some of them bitterly complaining about the textbooks and the benign image of Portugal's colonialism they conveyed. And this is another aspect that I've not mentioned until now. The fact that until recently, most history textbooks in middle and high school levels of history teaching, most of them ended up conveying the same benign image of the Portuguese colonial rule during the 16th and 17th century, and omitting or very briefly mentioning the dimensions that I've talked about earlier, the exploitative character of the Portuguese colonial rule, racial discrimination, violence, sexual violence also over women of African, Asian, and Amerindian descent, and also slave trade and slavery as components, central components of the Portuguese imperial past. In fact, in the past 2 decades, an unprecedented involvement of activists and civic groups in the public debate about the colonial past occurred, and the growing centrality of post-colonial issues on the international scene and also in Portugal, along with the role played by indigenous leaders, intellectuals and activists across Asia, Africa and Latin America, also pressed for a different account of the colonial past in Portugal. And one of the main demands was highlighting the role played by the local populations across Africa, America, and Asia, as well as their complex responses to European conquest and Portuguese conquest in particular. On a related front, social movements in Brazil also contributed to the emergence of a different outlook of colonialism, and the increasing preeminence of African Brazilians in present-day Brazilian culture and intellectual life led to the questioning of historical narratives that omitted the role of women and men of African descent in the building of colonial Brazil. In parallel, an increasing number of African artists produced significant work concerning aspects of colonial violence, such as slavery and the slave trade, forced labor, racial discrimination, and land dispossession. As for Portugal, all these developments outside the country had an impact, as I said, in Portuguese society, in particular urban areas like of course, Lisbon and Porto and Coimbra, also important because of its academic population. So student life also played a role here, and different kinds of activism played an important role in the past 2 decades. As a matter of fact, colonial violence has been a central focus of artistic production for contemporary artists and writers. And as a matter of fact, Portuguese literature of the past decade paid an increasing attention to the colonial past, and also significant was the increasing presence of African Portuguese voices in the public sphere. Until recently, men and women of African descent were largely underrepresented in positions of power in Portugal. And in spite of the large number of Black men and women, their presence in universities, in political parties and on company boards is minimal still nowadays, and mostly because of the racial discrimination that still prevails in many sectors of society, combined with an unequal access to economic resources. However, thanks to the efforts of Black artists, musicians, activists, intellectuals, and politicians, their presence in Portuguese public sphere is increasing, and it's nowadays stronger and growing. And the same could be said of public awareness about issues such as racial discrimination and unequal access to citizenship and economic rights. Also noteworthy is the ongoing project for creating a memorial to the transatlantic slave trade in Lisbon. And this is the webpage that talks about this initiative. Sorry, can you see it? So this is a memorial for the persons, the enslaved persons, not just to the people of African descent, men and women who were enslaved by the Portuguese, but all enslaved persons. So it's a very plural memorial. It is going to be inaugurated very, very soon in Lisbon, in one of the squares that used to be a place where, well, people don't know for sure, but they're not very far from this location. It was the place where many sub-Saharan Africans, enslaved sub-Saharan Africans, used to be sold to Lisbon residents. And this is a monument that evokes a plantation, a sugarcane plantation, which was one of the areas in colonial Brazil and other parts of the Portuguese Empire where slave labor force was mostly employed. If you want to learn more about this is the webpage that gives you all the information about this memorial. It's going to be inaugurated very, very soon. It was supposed to be been inaugurated last year, but the pandemic prevented it from happening. The author of this is an initiative of a group of citizens, many of them Black Portuguese, and the artist that was selected after international competition was this man, Kiluani Kiaenda from Angola, one of the areas of Africa from where more men and women were taken forcefully to America as enslaved persons. And so in the past, I'd say 5 years or so, the coverage of the media about these topics is increasing steadily. And this is just one example of many articles available at the internet talking about not just this memorial, but well, what the author of this monument is saying is that there is the need for reconciliation, and the Portuguese reconciliation with its colonial past won't happen without accepting and discussing in an open and critical way slavery and slave trade in Portugal. So, as I said, examples similar to this can be found in present-day media. This is another example about the discussion that is underway in Portugal, this time about a really surprising initiative, the so-called Museum of the Discoveries, because in parallel to these increasing critical debates about the Portuguese colonial past, there's still a lot of people around convinced that the Portuguese colonial past should not be questioned. Instead, it should continue to be celebrated. And this includes the mayor of Lisbon, a member of the Socialist Party, the mayor of Lisbon, and I underscore this, is a member of the Socialist Party. So this shows you how transversal and widespread this idea of a positive Portuguese colonial past is in present-day society. The Lisbon mayor, a few years ago, announced his decision to create in Lisbon a so-called Museum of the Discovery, dedicated to the celebration of Portugal's maritime discoveries. It would be like a kind of a theme park about the Portuguese colonial past. Immediately after this announcement, citizens, activists, and artists and intellectuals, many of them of African descent, opposed to the project. And this is this article here is one of many examples of articles, open letters, signed by a lot of people against this so-called Museum of the Discovery. And in the past 2-3 years, the public debate about the museum was particularly intense, which is good because it brings to the public sphere all these topics and forces people to discuss. Of course, it's sometimes very tense. There's a lot of people angry about this. But this debate is, in my view, positive because it materializes in a series of newspaper articles and TV shows and devoted to the way present-day Portuguese deal with their colonial past, and in parallel to all those who argue that a more critical debate about the colonial past is necessary. Others really fiercely oppose to such a claim and argue that there is no need to revisit such painful past events. And those who complain about this debate declare that it is useless to, or even negative for present-day Portugal to discuss these matters because it would foster racial hate in an allegedly non-racist country. So the students who are about to come to Portugal this fall will probably come across many Portuguese will say that, well, Portugal is the least racist country in Europe, or even not racist. There are still a lot of people all over the Portuguese society, from the elite groups to middle-class groups, that still believed in a very deeply way that this is the case, that the Portuguese are not racist. Many complain about this debate, of course, sometimes in a very bitter and aggressive way, and they also argued that Portugal does not need such a debate based on issues originating from the so-called political correctness coming from the US. So these are arguments that are frequently voiced by those who are critical about this increasing critical debate about the Portuguese colonial past. I will end my talk with another example. 3 years ago, in 2017, a statue, a very controversial statue was erected in Lisbon. This is the statue I'm talking to you about. It represents the 17th century Jesuit Antonio Vieira, a famous Jesuit in Brazil. And the Catholic Church, along with Lisbon, with the Lisbon mayor I've mentioned a while ago, funded the initiative and sponsored the initiative paying homage to Vieira. And as you can see here, the monument represents this missionary standing alongside a group of young Amerindians, all of them in a very submissive attitude. And in the plaque here, this plaque below the statue, Vieira is rather anachronistically presented as the 17th century, and I quote, fighter for human rights, end of quote. 17th century fighter for human rights. When Black Portuguese activists learned about this statue, well, and you can see the inauguration here with the Portuguese dignitaries, the church high representatives, the mayor of Lisbon, so it was a major venue. But of course, when Black Portuguese activists learned about this statue, they immediately protested against it and reminded the public that Vieira, this missionary, was a fierce supporter of the enslavement of Black Africans and their use as forced laborers in colonial Brazil. And when they learned about the initiative, and anti-racist associations along with African Portuguese groups announced that they were going to express their disagreement in a demonstration scheduled for the day when the statue was to be inaugurated by the mayor of Lisbon and the Catholic Church senior authorities. On the day of the inauguration, a group of far-right radicals arrived early, and here they are, and surrounded the statue and remained there, claiming that their action aimed at protecting Vieira and Portuguese national identity from the alleged aggression of the demonstrators. And the event turned out to be very tense, with far-right and anti-racist activists facing each other and exchanging bitter insults. So this is another example of events taking place in present-day Lisbon. But also, I think it is significant to underscore the fact that in 2017, it is still possible to erect a statue like this in Lisbon. I think this is a clear indication of the fact that in present-day Portugal, there is still a long way to go in terms of the critical debate about these events, the public critical debate about these topics. And well, not surprisingly, after the inauguration and the months that followed, several activists ended up writing these sentences like you see, F colonialism or decolonize. And of course, authorities classified these initiatives as vandalizing. Activists classified them as adding information to this statue. So they argued that this statue was omitting a lot of important things, so they wanted to add more information. So the controversy is taking place, and I sincerely think that it's important to foster this debate and also have initiatives to contest or to subject the deeply rooted traditional narrative to some questioning. For instance, this monument I've talked about earlier, celebrating the Portuguese discoveries built under the dictatorship, it's still there, but now it's a very interesting place for exhibits that precisely address the omitted vexed topics about the Portuguese imperial past, like slavery, exploitation, land dispossession, racial discrimination, and also artistic initiatives take place here. For instance, this is a group of Black activists and artists who did a performance precisely over these monuments. So this is a major tourist attraction in Lisbon. So there is the need, in my view, to contextualize in a better way this monument, explain to tourists that this is a controversial monument. There are some who think that this should be demolished. Some others think that this should be this should remain there, but just contextualize, and people who visit it should be given more information about this moment, when it was built, what purpose. But I think initiatives like this also are also productive in the sense that they destabilize the official narrative and have more information and make these events or make these monuments kind of a more representative of present day Portuguese society, which is deeply multi-ethnic and multi-racial. My final image here is about one example of recent exhibits, because this is this monument. Inside it, there is a place for small exhibits, and the current director, is sponsoring a series of important exhibits touching precisely the vexed aspects of the Portuguese colonial past. So this is an exhibit that was held in 2017, for the fall 2017, about slavery and transatlantic slave trade. Presently, there is another very interesting exhibit on display there called Visions of Empire. And this is an example of a famous journalist in Portugal suggesting that it was there is the need to implode, to tear down this monument. So I mean, this is controversial, of course, and we can discuss this. The proposal for imploding the monument is for some the most logical step. For others, it's an outrage. Very final remarks, and I'll stop here. This is a very recent interview given by the Portuguese Prime Minister about this debate I'm talking to you about. And this Prime Minister, a man called Afonso Costa, is from Indian and African descent. He's from a mixed blood family of Indian and East African origins. And he claims that it's very negative to foster this debate I'm talking to you about, because he considers that it is an artificial debate that is contributing to open a lot of wounds and in the Portuguese identity. And I'm quoting him: "Our identity has nothing to do with the debates that are being fostered by these intellectuals, activists, and civic groups." So this, and these are words uttered by the present-day Portuguese Prime Minister, more or less by the same time the Council of Europe issued a report saying that Portugal must do more to confront its colonial past. This is very recent. It was issued, I think, late May, and it's very critical about the situation in Portugal, and in particular about public authorities' neglect of this debate, and they are still, I wouldn't say hostile, but very reluctant into fostering this debate. And I think the examples I've just given you, the fact that the mayor of Lisbon is still thinking about creating a kind of a museum of the discoveries in Lisbon, or the Portuguese Prime Minister classifying these debates as negative and artificial and threatening for Portuguese identity. So it's identity politics, no doubt about it, but the other way around. It's like the people who think like the Portuguese Prime Minister consider that there is a Portuguese identity, there is one Portuguese identity, kind of a almost essentialist notion of Portuguese identity, And the debates that are taking place and being fostered by different groups and peoples are negative and artificial because and dangerous and threatening because he thinks that they will contribute to social anger and racial anger in a country that alleged is not racist. And just very recently, there is a brand new national plan for fighting racism and discrimination, and it includes, of course, a few lines about rethinking the teaching of the history of the Portuguese colonial past. Let's hope that this plan will be implemented in a coherent and effective way, in particular regarding history textbooks, but not just history textbooks, but also I would say the practices of history professors, history teachers in Portuguese middle schools and high schools. I'll stop here. I'm sorry I spoke for too long. I'll stop here and pass the word to Taku. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you very much, Professor Cardim, Professor Oliveira. Once again, let's start the lecture. So before I ask Dr. Renzo for the lecture, I will give the word. I will ask Professor Galime for some words. So on behalf of the University of Florence.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say a few words to introduce Chiara Renzo talk today on behalf of the University of Florence. Some of the experiences and the workshop that we'll propose this year, this autumn, and next year in the semester of activity of the HIPS at University of Florence will precisely concern Florence as a place of memory. And this not only concern the past linked to the medieval age and the early modern era, for which Florence is recognized in all the world, the Firenze del Rinascimento, Florence Renaissance, but also for more contemporary past. And we can mention two public history projects, and you can have a look on the website, and Chiara, I hope, show you some images of those. The first one is the exhibition Firenze in Guerra, Florence at War, 1940-1944, which I curated with a colleague of mine on daily life in Florence during the Second World War. We can see the transformation of the city among many topics, protection of monuments and other cultural treasures from the destruction, war gardens, the rationing of food, etc. And the second one is Firenze Imperiale, mapping colonial heritages, promoted by two young researchers from European Institute in Fiesole, who have examined the traces of colonial past in Florence, street names, monuments, buildings, etc. Indeed, the collection of colonial traces. And these are two of many projects we will talk about. But today, Chiara is here to present the CIRIT project, an ongoing project promoted by Saga Department and a network of other institutions in Tuscany. CIRIT is dedicated to analyze the system of internment and repression in Tuscany from 1940 to 1944. Fascist government, in fact, in the beginning of the war in Italy in June 1940, opened about 50 internment camps for civilians, and some of them in Tuscany, with prisoner camps and other forms and sites of reclusion. So the project will propose an analysis of these events, but also offer a public history project about these camps as places of memory. Chiara Renzo carried out their doctoral thesis on history of Jewish refugees in Italy between 1943 to 1951, analyzing in particular the political, humanitarian, and social aspects. And her PhD thesis received the Fossili Foundation Prize. And she was a research fellow at University of Venice, and she earned a fellowship and grants for many international research institutes of Holocaust studies, Yad Vashem, Wiener Library, among them. And she published articles in scientific journal and book chapter in Italian and English. So Chiara, please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone, and thank you for having me today, and let me presenting my project in this program. As Professor Galimi said, the title of this project is in English, The Fascist Internment System in Tuscany During World War II, From History to Memory. The project focuses on the fascist internment system, especially in Tuscany between 1940, when Italy joined World War II, and 1944, when the region was liberated by the Allied Army. During these 4 years, the fascist government adopted a series of measures restricting individual freedom. These aim to isolate, marginalize, and control any person which was considered as a danger or a potential danger for public order or national security. So these provisions resulted in a widespread and articulated network of internment devices through which the state institutionally violated individuals' rights and constantly perpetrated its political powers, the abuse of its political power. So as these are the links that maybe Professor Galimi could share in the chat while I'm talking, the link that I showed you before. But here, as you can see, we have a list of such provision, because for this project, we are very much interested in mapping the site of internment, but also to frame all typologies of internment in this analysis, and also to analyze the individual experience of the internees. And of course, we are also interested in the memory of these sites and of this personal experience in the public sphere. So here we have a list of the provisions used by the fascist government to intern civilians. Some of them were already in use well before the war. But during the war, we can say that the fascist government tried to simplify, from the bureaucratic point of view, the implementation of these internment measures. And as a consequence, the number of internees also increased. The first and oldest of these fascist internment provisions is confinement. Confinement was used to isolate from society in rural area or in small islands all those people who opposed fascism, intellectuals, politicians, but also common people suspected to perform anti-fascist activities. In addition to these categories of civilians, confinement was also used by the fascist government in order to marginalize homosexuals or women whose private lives were considered dangerous for moral directives, or were not in line with the fascist female model. Also, confinement was used by the fascist government to intern relatives of anti-fascists, and also all those people who manifested any kind of opposition to the regime. But starting from June 1940, when Italy joined the Second World War, the fascist government, as Professor Galimi said before, adopted new measures. for the internment, especially of civilians, both foreigners and also Italians, who were considered as a dangerous or suspicious in war circumstances. On the one hand, with the internment of foreign citizens or enemy aliens, the fascist government intended to safeguard the country's military security, so it aimed to avoid espionage or to prevent the sharing of intelligence information that could be provided from internal opponents, or prevent also the repatriation of all those people who were in military age, and so they wanted to hinder their enrollment in the army in enemy countries, of course. On the other hand, the internment of Italian civilians officially aimed to maintain the public order, but it was in fact used as an alternative. This practice was used as an alternative to confinement because it was quicker in terms of bureaucratic procedures, and it was easy to intern people because it was only an administrative procedures, which not required the judgment and a long process to intern people. Civilians forced to internment were accommodated in concentration camps or in forced residency, usually in small villages located in the most rural or disadvantaged areas of the country. And this forced residency is called in Italian internamento libero, which we can translate as free internment. Instead, concentration camps were set up by the fascist government in private or public buildings, which were equipped and for the internment of such big groups of civilians with coats, canteens, and toilets. Now I want to show you some concentration sites in Tuscany. The first one is the concentration camps, which was set up very close to Florence in the hills surrounding the city in Bagno Ripoli. This is the name of the little town. And the name of the villa is Villa La Selva. Villa La Selva was a private building which belonged to an Italian Jew who in 1930, after the Martial law, decided to left for Palestine. And this building was identified by the local police as a suitable building to intern people because it was isolated, let's say, but it was very, very close to the town. It was on a hill, but very, very close to the city, to Florence, but also to the town of Bagno Ripoli. It accommodated mainly enemy aliens of different nationality: British, French, Greeks, Norwegians, Russians. There were many Jews of foreign nationality. From 1941, when Italy occupied part of Yugoslavia, there were also many Slovenians and Croatians interned in these concentration camps. And also from 1942, when Italy started to deport the Jews of British nationality from the Italian colony in Libya, there were also a group of Libyan Jews. So we can say that there were around 100 to 120 people interned in these concentration camps. The second concentration camps is another private building which was Villa Oliveto, and it's located in Arezzo province, in the town called Civitella della Chiana. Again, we can find here enemy aliens, especially of British and French nationality, of different faith, from Orthodox Jews, Muslims, and Hindus. And also from 1942, there were five families deported from Libya of Jews deported from Libya. They also were of British nationality, and these were very numerous families. So even if they were 5 families, there were a total of 50 Libyan Jews interned in these concentration camps. The third concentration camp is very close again to Florence, in a sort of villa castle in the town which is called Rovezzano. And we know that people interned here, civilians interned in these concentration camps, were mainly Italians and Yugoslavs. What happened after 1941, when the Axis powers occupied Yugoslavia? We can see in this map that Italy also expanded along its northeastern border. So the brown area that you can see in this map was occupied by the Italians. So in analogy to the policy adopted in Italy, also here in the occupied territories of Yugoslavia, the fascist government implemented these internment measures to control, of course, civilians considered as a possible threat to public order. In particular, the fascist government aimed to calm down any kind of liberation movement, but also the fascist regime adopted a very cruel racial policy that led to violence, to massacre, and to deportation of civilians. So in order to increase the capacity of the concentration camps in Italy, which were already full to capacity, the fascist government first tried to set up 2 concentration camps close, one really in the area occupied by the Italian in the island of Rab, that you can see also in this slide, which was famous for the really hard condition. You must consider that around 1,200 people died because of starvation and because of the lack of medical care during the war. And the other one was set up in Gonars, which is at the border with Italy. And it was formerly camps for prisoners of war, but the fascist regime decided to use it for civilians. When it was full to capacity again, there were around 2,000 people, so 2,000 civilians interned in Gonars. The fascist government opened new concentration camps. So we have another concentration camps in Tuscany, which was again in the province of Arezzo, in the town called Renici di Anghiari, which was built as a prisoners of war camp, but again the fascist regime decided to use it as a concentration camp for civilians deported from the occupied territories of Yugoslavia. It was active only between 1942 to 1943, and around 4,000 internees lived there in a very hard life. Another type of internment measure that we want to trace with this project is the so-called internamento libero. Now I'm showing you this map of Tuscany, but this is not updated because I'm showing you an old map that was created by Professor Galimi some years ago. She was involved in this project of our department, which mainly focused on the internment and deportation of the Jews. So here you can see only those locations which were used to intern Jews, especially non-Italian Jews in Tuscany. There are many towns that you can see here. Now we have estimated around 80 towns which were used to intern civilians in Tuscany. And it's interesting, it's very interesting to study this measure, because through this measure since the internists were living in the towns, we can see how they interact with the local population. So it's a very interesting and overlooked aspect of the fascist internment system. We also include in our project the so-called campi provinciali. Campi provinciali are used to refer to the camps used as part of the system of deportation of civilians to Nazi extermination camps. So in 1943, when the Fascist Grand Council, which was the supreme body of the fascist party, held a motion of no confidence to Mussolini, and Mussolini went to prison, on the other side of Italy, in the south of Italy, the Allies arrived and liberated the southern region. So Italy was a country split in two. Italy declared in this moment its unconditional surrender, but the country was divided because the south was liberated, but the north was in Axis end. So Mussolini, supported by the Germans who occupied the northern region, escaped from prison and established the Italian Social Republic. So these camps, these campi provinciali, is used to refer to the camps of the Italian Social Republic funded by Mussolini after the Italian armistice in 1943. And they were essentially used to gather all those people, Jews and all the civilians who the fascist government want to deport to the extermination camps. So it served as a transit site, let's say. And in Tuscany, there were two camps which served before 1943 that we have seen before as concentration camps that became campi provinciali. I'm talking about Bagno a Ripoli and Civitella della Chiana, the first two camps that I showed you before. But two more camps were set up by Mussolini in this last phase of the war. One was located in Grosseto province, and the other one in Lucca province. In our project, before I go on, in our project, since we are very interested in the social experience of the war, we want to include also all those sites used to concentrate people sent to forced labors, and also all those camps which were used to intern prisoners of war in Tuscany. I'd like to show you who are the partners of this project, because this project is in partnership with three main institutions in Tuscany. The first one is the State Archives in Florence, where I spent, and I'm still there, 1 year of my project. And the State Archives in Florence preserve a big collection of documents which can tell us a lot about the civilian intern in this province. So as a result of my here at the State Archives analyzing this material, we would like to create an online exhibition which we want to serve as a tool for teachers, because both me and Professor Galimi are involved in several professional development programs for teachers. So we know that it's important to learn in school about what happened in Italy and how Italy contribute with this internment system to the deportation and to what happened in the last phase of the war, especially. And another partner of the project that some students will visit in the fall is the Museum and Documentation Center of Deportation and Resistance in Prato. The museum it's very involved in preserving the memory of the deportation, the internment, and also the resistance in the region, in Tuscany. And also there is also an exhibition, very interesting exhibition with important documents and items that help the visitors to understand the extent of the deportation from Italy, and especially from Tuscany. So with them, I will be there from September as part of this project. And with them, we would like to develop a sort of map of the internment sites, and to create hopefully an app that can function with a QR code located in each site of internment. So it can be useful for visitors, for tourists, for schools, for everyone who want to know more about the urban, about the local history, which is not only local, of course, it's also national. And the last partner of this project is the Historical Institute for Resistance and Contemporary Society in Livorno. I will be there in the last month of my project in February next year. And with them also, we will see how to disseminate the result of this research. We hope to organize some events live, not on Zoom, we hope, but let's see. And finally, I would like to show you the Auschwitz Memorial that some of you will be able to visit during your time in Florence. I just want to tell you a few words. This was an installation which was originally placed in Auschwitz, but it was brought back to Italy recently because it was not considered in line with the museum guidelines somehow. So you will be able also to see this important memorial site in Florence. I think that my presentation can end it here. So if Professor Galimi or someone else from Florence want to add something, please.
Francesca, if you want to say hello.
Thank you very much to Valeria and Chiara. I think that these internships, I hope, finger crossed, it will be available in fall. So I think there will be time to visit all these, not all, many of these sites, and also to organize some PAPs and some experience, for the students. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So once again, thank you very much. So Dr. Renzo, for your very insightful lecture, and also it reveals to us the many unknown site of the memory or the history in Florence, in Toscana.